So hi everyone, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us here today. We're very pleased to have and welcome Joel Witt. He's a distinguished fellow at the Henry L. Stimson Center and former director of the 38 North program. Earlier in his career, Joel served at the U.S. State Department, where he helped negotiate the 1994 U.S. DPRK agreed framework and oversaw its implementation until 2002. Over the next 15 years, he met regularly with senior North Korean officials and later held fellowships at Johns Hopkins SAIS and the Stimson Center. He's also the co-author of Going Critical, the first North Korea nuclear crisis published by the Brookings Institution Press. Joel's new book, Fallout, the inside story of how America failed to disarm North Korea, draws on more than 300 interviews with officials in Washington, Seoul, and Beijing, as well as his own 2 decades of direct experience to tell the untold story of how 6 U.S. presidents tried but failed to halt Pyongyang's nuclear ambitions. It's a gripping and behind-the-scenes account of policy debates, diplomatic gambits, and covert operations that have brought us to the present moment, with North Korea now capable of threatening U.S. And Northeast Asia on the edge of a nuclear arms race. We are also equally fortunate to have Barbara Demick here today as a moderator of our discussion. Barbara is a longtime foreign correspondent, former bureau chief for the Los Angeles Times in both Seoul and Beijing, and the author of several acclaimed books, including Logovina Street, Life and Death in Sarajevo Neighborhood, Eat the Buddha, and the award-winning Nothing to Envy, Ordinary Lives in North Korea, which brought the human stories behind North Korea's isolation to readers around the world. With their combined experience and insight into both policy and lived reality, this promises to be a rich and illuminating conversation. So please join me in welcoming Joel and Barbara today.
Thank you very much, Joel. So I enjoyed reading this book because a lot of the negotiations were things that I covered as a journalist. And I wish I had called you more often as a source, but you probably would have hung up the phone or not called me back. But it really is the kind of thing that the public and journalists don't get to see very often. I just wanted to start at the beginning. How did you get involved with North Korea?
Oh, well, that's a great question. I am not an expert on Korea, or maybe now I'm more of an expert, but when I started this, and when I started working on North Korea at the State Department, I had been there for a while beforehand, working on U.S.-Soviet arms control talks. And, then the unexpected happened. The Soviet Union collapsed, and it wasn't so interesting anymore. And then I sort of floated around trying to find something interesting to do, and I ended up working on North Korea in 1993 because I had friends who were working on it. And at that time, there was a big crisis. And I can talk a little bit more about that and the Clinton administration, and then maybe we could have a conversation as well. When I started doing this in 1993, North Korea had just announced that it was going to withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And, for a few years before that, it seemed like the North Koreans were on track to joining the treaty, to being in the treaty, to agreeing to international inspections of what we thought was a growing nuclear weapons program, and to moving on to a glide path in terms of better relations with the United States. And this started to happen after decades of hostility. And the reason it started to happen wasn't because it wasn't some ideological thing. And this gets to an important point I think people need to understand about the North Koreans. They are driven by geopolitics. That is the big issue that drives their external policy. And that's why whenever North Koreans visited New York, they'd meet with Henry Kissinger, who at one point considered bombing their country in 1969, but who was the grand master of geopolitics. So the North Koreans were driven by geopolitics then because their Soviet ally had disappeared. They collapsed. The Chinese were reaching out to South Korea, at the time North Korea's main enemy. And so they decided to engage the United States, and their nuclear program was on the chopping block. So the Clinton administration, after North Korea threatened to withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, engaged them in negotiations as well as pursued sanctions against Pyongyang. I'm not going to go through the year and a half of back and forth in terms of the negotiations, but I will say that the negotiations essentially collapsed in May of 1994, and we were on track for a second Korean War. That's when Jimmy Carter stepped in, visited North Korea, met with Kim Il-sung, reached a deal which the White House didn't really like, but had no choice but to accept, and got us back into negotiations. And that led in October to the first denuclearization deal ever reached with North Korea. It was called the Agreed Framework. So the Clinton administration had succeeded essentially in getting North Korea to agree to denuclearize. I mean, it wasn't easy and the price was very high. It included building $5 billion worth of 2 reactors and other steps to improve relations.
Well, but this agreed framework was an amazing deal. And this is when I started to become aware of North Korea, because I guess it was an international consortium that was called Keto, was going in and actually building these light water reactors that were to be used to solve North Korea's terrible electricity problems. The place was dark most of the time.
I mean, if you think about it, here it is, United States and North Korea. By the 1990s, we had fought a war with North Korea. We essentially had decades of a hostile relationship with virtually no contact at all. I mean, American journalists finally visited North Korea, I think, in the 1970s, after 20 years of no contact at all. So it was a difficult negotiation.
And can we just sort of set the context for the 1990s? We're talking, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, North Korea was in this kind of death spiral where they'd lost their patron. The factories were closing because they couldn't get supplies from, the Soviets and the Eastern Europeans who had produced, everything from incubators to weapons, and among them, the contributing factors to this death spiral was that there was no electricity. The factories couldn't operate.
Right, and that's why.
So that's why the light water reactors.
That's why we included these 2 reactors. And I got to say, the architect of this deal, I was not the architect of this deal. I was just a staff person, but Bob Gallucci was the architect of this deal. And I remember going into his office one day with my colleague, Gary Seymour. We were his 2 staff people. And he started talking about building light water reactors in North Korea. The technology was advanced. They cost $5 billion to build them. And we thought he was crazy. But it turned out to be the right approach. And there was, of course, resistance to doing it inside the U.S. government. particularly among senior officials. So there was one meeting where, the senior officials were grousing about it. And Tony Lake, who was the national security advisor, said to them, aren't you willing to do what it takes to protect the 30,000 American troops in South Korea? And of course, no one was going to say, no, we really aren't willing to protect them. And that helped push the ball forward.
A very challenging period. And Kim Il-sung died in the middle of these.
Right,
And
right.
I think Kim Il-sung met with Jimmy Carter, and then
He died on the first day of the negotiations between the United States and North Korea in Geneva. And that, of course, people thought, well, gee, that's the end of this. But in fact, he and his son, who succeeded him, Kim Jong Un, they were committed to this track of engagement. And so the talks started up very soon afterwards. And in part of that was because Bill Clinton issued condolences on the death of Kim Il-sung. So fast forward 2009, when ex-President Bill Clinton visited Pyongyang to retrieve two journalists who had been seized on the Chinese border, he had dinner with Kim Jong-il. And one of the first things Kim Jong-il said to Bill Clinton was, we so appreciated you sending condolences on the death of his father. And it was clear you're a man of honor who we can trust.
wow, kind words. You weren't just, pushing papers in Washington. You were on the line. You went to North Korea.
Yeah. So after the negotiations, I was, Bob Gallucci left. He went to become the dean of the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. And my colleague, Gary Seymour, went to the NSC. And I was left behind to implement this enormous deal.
Maybe they knew something you didn't know.
I know, now in retrospect, I can see that, maybe they were getting out while the going was good.
But when was your first trip to North Korea?
I visited North Korea first time in 1996. And I remember it. I mean, it was obviously an eye-opening experience, but the thing I remember most is, part of the deal was the North Koreans would dismantle their main nuclear facility, which was at a place called Yeonbyeon. And there were Americans stationed there to store, this gets a little complicated. There was plutonium that could be used for atom bombs in spent fuel from their nuclear reactor. So we sent Americans there from the Department of Energy to work with the North Koreans to safely store the fuel so it could be shipped out. Mm-hmm. And so I went to visit the work site. And so we drove up to the gate. And as you can imagine, it was very heavily guarded. And, I had my foreign ministry escort with me. And so, we had to show them our identification papers and, who were we? And they looked at me because I was an American. And what happened was they let me pass, but they didn't let the foreign ministry people pass. They kept their own people out. And that said something to me about, bureaucracies everywhere are sort of, they're not all one group of people. And foreign ministry people were viewed as, we don't want them in our facilities.
And then your book opens with this amazing experience in 99, when I guess you spent a longer time there at Kumchang-ri. You want to talk about that?
Yeah.
Yeah, why that was, because that sounds actually pretty terrifying.
Yeah, so
The beginning of the book is in the spring of 1999. I was held hostage at a remote North Korean army base near the mountainous border with China. I'm just, this is the journalist in me. Here's the diplomat. So what happened?
well,
Talk about that story.
so in 1998, some of the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, concluded, that's a US government intelligence agency, concluded that North Korea was cheating on the deal we reached in 1994. And they had built a nuclear facility inside a mountain on the Chinese border at Kamchangri. They concluded that. Other intelligence agencies like the CIA weren't so sure. But DIA was adamant to the point where, when we were getting ready, the North Koreans agreed that we could inspect the facility. When we were getting ready, the Defense Intelligence Agency came to brief our team that was going to go to inspect on what we would find. So they brought this plaster of Paris model and showed it to us. It was a model of the mountain. And at the end of the briefing, they said, here's what you're going to find inside the mountain. And they pulled the top off the model, and there was a little reactor in a cavern inside the mountain. Okay, that was impressive, but we flew off to North Korea, and we inspected the site. And I'll get to why we were held hostage in a moment, but we didn't find a reactor. There was nothing there. We were held hostage because, you can imagine here was an opportunity to go visit a North Korean facility, and it was largely a military base, and, be on the ground and look around. So my team of inspectors, most of them were actually from the US intelligence community. A few of them were nuclear experts, but most of them were intelligence analysts who had a once-in-a-lifetime experience to visit North Korea. And one of them started to sketch the wooden barracks at the military facility, which was not allowed. So they stopped the inspection, North Koreans, put us in this conference room, was surrounded by North Korean soldiers, and we could see their bayonets were out. Some of the Americans thought we were about to be executed. And I spent a couple hours arguing with the base commander about how to proceed. Obviously, we weren't executed. And what happened finally, which is also another interesting thing, essentially our escorts from Pyongyang, who were foreign ministry people from the military intelligence agency, they worked with us. And they basically lied to their military guys and told them, oh, these guys are okay. That one guy just made a mistake. You shouldn't hold them hostage anymore. And the military guys listened. So it was essentially the guys from Pyongyang working with us against their own military.
One of the things I loved in the book was the description of what it was like when you were just released from being held hostages, that the North Koreans set up a kiosk to sell you.
That was during the inspection. It was an underground area. So every day we had a little place where we would set ourselves up and put on whatever gear we had to put on. And the tunnel entrance was nearby. And right across from where our wooden shack was, the North Korean military set up a kiosk, and they were selling soft drinks and candy. And, they didn't like us there, that's for sure. But they figured they'd make some money off us.
Great.
If we were there.
It's great. Spirit.
So it was a little bit of a surprise.
The spirit. I guess they come in later, but parts of the book I loved were your dealings with various North Korean officials who some of whom were really amazing people. The female negotiator, Shea Sung-hui, who was, I guess, rumored to be the love child of Kim Il-sung, but probably not.
But now she's the foreign minister.
Yeah,
Yeah.
she was, I mean, what was it like to deal with her? You seem to be somewhat charmed.
Well, you know, we became friends over, I guess, over almost 20 years. We became friends, and obviously bright woman who grew up in the North Korean elite. Her stepfather was the prime minister at one point. She is believed to have been very close to Kim Jong Un and his sister when they were children. And I think that's true because it's become very clear during the Trump administration and afterwards that she is one of Kim Jong Un's closest confidants.
She comes in later.
She comes in later, but she, you know, she speaks Russian, Chinese, and English. She was in part educated abroad. And beyond that, she is probably the foremost expert on the United States in North Korea. She reads everything, not just security issues, everything imaginable. So when we had a dinner together on the margins of a private meeting in Berlin in 2008, and she was sitting next to me, and by then we were very friendly. And she says to me, she turns to me and says, "Have you read Hillary Clinton's book?" Because she had just read It Takes a Village. And, you know, I'm the American, and I said, gee, I really haven't read it. So she was very disappointed, and she didn't get to have a conversation about that. But she's been key for a number of years in terms of their foreign policy.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm probably moving too slowly, but this period of the 90s was very hopeful. I mean, in terms of diplomacy with North Korea. We won't get into the Middle East. It was also hopeful for the Middle East. There was this sort of golden period where it really looked like there might be a peace deal. And I think Madeleine Albright visited Pyongyang, and there was some talk that Clinton might visit. Can you talk about this burst of optimism and then what happened? Because, you know, not to get ahead of the story, but the agreed framework did fall apart.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you know, I mean, you had in the last year of the Clinton administration, you had a visit by the number 2 official in North Korea, Marshal Joe, to Washington. He met with Bill Clinton in the Oval Office. And so if you go online, you'll see a picture of the two of them, Marshal Joe in his uniform and Bill Clinton in the Oval Office. And Marshal Joe brought an invitation for Bill Clinton to visit North Korea. Well, you know, we don't just send an American president off to a place like North Korea without some careful preparation. So Madeleine Albright went instead. She had a very productive meeting with Kim Jong-il. And at the time, the issue was stopping North Korea's missile program, which, of course, today is an enormous threat. Back then, it was a really unique opportunity to end that program. The problem was that Albright and Kim Jong-il didn't resolve every issue. So they sent, you know, aides off to Kuala Lumpur to resolve the remaining issues. They couldn't come up with an agreement. And this was as the Clinton administration was running down and we were heading into the election. So the plan was to try to bridge the gap on the missile deal very quickly and to send Bill Clinton off to North Korea at the very end of the administration. well, we didn't resolve the gap, but the invitation was still out there for Bill Clinton. And it was a big problem for him because he really wanted to go. Even if there wasn't a sealed deal, he really wanted to go. None of his aides wanted him to go. And at the same time, Yasser Arafat wanted Clinton to have another Middle East summit and try to resolve the problems there. So Clinton decided to do the Middle East, not going to North Korea. It turned out, I don't know if it was the wrong decision, but he didn't clinch a Middle East deal. And he was pretty unhappy about having missed both opportunities.
So we come up to the Bush administration. This is where I started covering North Korea, and it seemed to me that there was always a lot of opposition to the agreed framework and these light water reactors. But then when you had, this agreement that had, Clinton's imprimatur on it, there was like a lot of reason to get rid of it. So
anything, one of the big slogans for the Bush administration was anything but Clinton, ABC.
yeah.
And there was a lot of opposition. This was a time when, the group known as neoconservatives like Dick Cheney, who just passed away, John Bolton, who was recently arrested, Condoleezza Rice, and others. They were neoconservatives essentially, and they didn't want to. The thing that their big thing was don't negotiate with countries like North Korea. And of course, we know with Iraq what happened there. So, there was a big push to somehow get out of the agreement. And they were aided by the North Koreans, who had been conducting activities starting in the late 1990s that they shouldn't have been conducting. And I'm not talking about Kim Jong Un. They had a secret program to try to develop uranium enrichment, which, in addition to plutonium, is the other path to building nuclear weapons. But we knew about it, and we had a plan to stop it, the Clinton administration. And if Al Gore had been elected, we would have implemented the plan. But he wasn't elected. The Bush administration essentially didn't do anything to stop the program, and finally sent an envoy to North Korea to give them an ultimatum to stop or else. And they refused to buckle under, although they offered to negotiate. And they offered to negotiate a better deal than the agreed framework that would have ended the uranium enrichment program. But the Bush administration refused to negotiate. The North Koreans withdrew from the agreement. They started producing plutonium again. They ended their pledge to rejoin the NPT, and their program took off.
And I guess the
rest of the story is, when Bush won the second term, he and Condoleezza Rice had a meeting where they said, gee, I think we got to negotiate with the North Koreans. And this is at a time where Dick Cheney and the others, their influence had declined because of the war in Iraq.
Yeah.
So, the Bush and Rice agreed that we got to negotiate with the North Koreans. And they set off trying to negotiate a deal which was very, very similar to the one that they had destroyed.
Yeah, they took apart one deal and they couldn't put it back together again.
So they tried to replicate it.
But things were getting worse. I mean, there was there was a nuclear test in 2006, was it?
2005, the first North Korean nuclear test.
Yes. So there were two under the Bush administration, nuclear tests.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that was the thing, the North Korean nuclear program was essentially contained by the agreed framework. And if the Bush administration had agreed to negotiate provisions to end the uranium enrichment program, that would have plugged that hole. But it wasn't contained because of what they did to the agreed framework, and the program took off. So you had nuclear tests, you had production of nuclear material, and the stockpile started to be built.
Then, and moving faster, we get to the Obama administration, where it seems like not much happened in 2 terms. I mean, it was like strategic patience. Was that the watchword?
Yeah, strategic patience. That was the Obama administration's policy. So when Obama took office in 2009, North Korea, they had some short-range missiles that could reach Japan, certainly South Korea. They had a small nuclear stockpile. By the time Obama left office in 2016, North Korea was clear they were going to build an arsenal of intercontinental ballistic missiles. And it was clear they were going to be armed with nuclear weapons, and not just regular nuclear weapons, but the North Koreans had started testing hydrogen, but much more powerful hydrogen bombs. So this was a period when the program literally took off, the nuclear program and the missile program. And, so you got to ask yourself, well, what was the Obama administration doing? Well, they had an overall policy of strategic patience, which was, we'll put pressure on North Korea, they'll come back to the negotiations, and we'll reach a deal. Sounds nice, but didn't work at all. First, we didn't really put pressure on North Korea. There were some sanctions at the beginning of the administration, and Rahm Emanuel, who was the White House chief of staff, told some senior officials in the White House, we're going to grab Kim Jong Un, Kim Jong Il, and I'm not going to use the 5-letter word, but we're going to grab him by we know what that word is. And a State Department official said to me, we didn't grab him that way. We grabbed him by the elbow, which essentially meant we didn't put a lot of pressure on him. And so that was half-hearted. Obama, by the middle of the administration, realized that this was a big danger in the North Korean program. He ordered the Pentagon to come up with a plan for a preemptive attack on North Korea. He wasn't going to attack them, but he wanted future presidents to have the plan. And that didn't work either, because the Pentagon couldn't come up with a plan where they could assure him they'd get all the missiles. And on top of that, North Korea would probably launch an offensive into South Korea if the U.S. attacked. So that didn't work either. We came up with, Susan Rice, towards the end of the administration, came up with a plan to put more pressure on China. It was called the China Play. And that consisted of stepped up sanctions. So if you look at 2016, sanctions were enacted and China went along that broadened the restrictions beyond just the WMD program to economic restrictions. We also deployed, or we announced we were going to deploy THAAD in South Korea, which is basically an anti-missile defense. But the Chinese didn't like that because they thought that had implications for their own ballistic missiles nearby. And there's a line in the book where Susan Rice and Tony Blinken, who was the Deputy Secretary of State, would tell Chinese officials, if you don't like THAAD, you're not going to like what comes next. pretty clear threat. So they were putting pressure on the Chinese. At the same time, the administration was trying to build cooperation. And they did that through, it's not entirely clear, but it seems Susan Rice had talks with the Chinese at the end of the Obama administration to discuss the future of U.S. forces in Northeast Asia, and probably to hold out the prospect of reducing the U.S. military presence if the North Korean threat was reduced. And then there were also talks about how to cooperate if North Korea collapsed, because that was a big fear that the Chinese had. North Korea might collapse. It would create chaos on their border. It might even provoke a U.S.-Chinese military clash as we both rushed into the North to try to take it over.
Do you want to speak a little bit more about the role of China in these efforts? I mean, there were times that the U.S. seemed to be working with China, like during the so-called six-party talks. But then there was also this rivalry between China and the U.S. for influence in North Korea. It was always a very complicated equation.
Yeah, well, that's exactly it. You know, there were boundaries within which Chinese policy would move, but they wouldn't move beyond the boundary that we wanted them to move into, which was to put so much pressure on North Korea that we thought the North Koreans would have no choice but to give up their weapons. And, you know, it can be illustrated essentially in looking at 1 year, which was 2010. The beginning of 2010.
That was a bad year.
That was a bad year.
I was just getting up to that.
Oh, you were?
Year.
Okay.
Right. Go ahead. Let's talk about that bad year.
Well, it shows Chinese policy, how it would oscillate.
Yeah.
So the beginning of 2010, the North Koreans sunk a South Korean Navy ship called the Cheonan. It's pretty clear they torpedoed it. In reaction to that, the United States and South Korea were seeking sanctions against North Korea. Chinese wouldn't play ball. They weren't interested in imposing more sanctions. And so Americans got the standard response was, well, you need to talk more to to North Korea, sorry. And then at the end of the year, the North Koreans attacked a South Korean island. And we were on the path to war. We were on the path to Second Korean War. So the United States appealed, and South Korea appealed to the Chinese to talk to the North Koreans and to rein them in. And the Chinese, all evidence suggests the Chinese did that. And, you know, obviously there was no war. So in an extreme situation, the Chinese can, you know, I don't want to say force the North Koreans to do what they want, but they certainly can become much more active in getting North Korea to cooperate.
When I was in Beijing, the sort of line you'd always hear from the Chinese policy experts was that maybe China had the power to make North Korea collapse, but they didn't want it to collapse, so they just played along. I don't know if that was true, but I can say that the Chinese did not like North Korea. Like anybody who talked to, they felt, I think, more aggrieved than we Americans, because they were a lot closer.
Yeah, no, the Chinese and the North Koreans don't like the Chinese, so it's a mutual dislike. But you know, it's geopolitics again.
Yeah. So the Obama administration. So 2 Obama terms, Obama won a Nobel Peace Prize, did nothing on North Korea.
Essentially, they did nothing. I mean, at the end of the administration, they finally woke up, and one of the people I interviewed was a senior White House official. And in talking about the 8 years experience, she said to me, the Obama administration went through 5 stages of grief in dealing with North Korea. And those 5 stages, I'm going to look them up. I can't remember, but the last stage is acceptance. And by the end of the Obama administration, they had reached acceptance of the fact that they would have to somehow reach a deal with North Korea. But time ran out.
Yeah, yeah. So you get a fresh approach with Donald Trump. And I think at some point, I don't know if he said this directly, Trump said he knew why his predecessors failed because they didn't do the obvious, which was talking to the North Koreans. And this was, even among the diplomats who are not necessarily supportive of Trump, there were many people who thought, like, let's just go sit down and talk with the top guy. I think Gallucci used to say, your pal, Robert Gallucci, used to say, it's not like if we sat down and talked, we'd agree to some stupid thing. Let's just try.
Right.
Let's try talking. And, there was thinking, I think that Trump was sort of untethered enough from the conventional foreign policy establishment to do what nobody else had done. And even on, I think that was a line from Bruce Cummings. So even on the left, there was support for Trump's outreach.
Exactly. And, I mean, Donald Trump's impulse is always to meet with the top guy from the other side,
Yeah,
right? You
yeah.
can see that today. You could see it in his first term. And, so that was his impulse with North Korea, although, he started out not knowing much about North Korea. And someone told me the funny story about how Trump would ask everyone he encountered, what do you think about North Korea? And, some people did have views, but he also asked Kid Rock on one occasion. And Kid Rock probably didn't know much about North Korea. But I think Trump's impulses were right, also because, it's clear, it was clear, it is clear that Kim Jong Un is the only guy who can reach a deal on nuclear issues in North Korea. His negotiators couldn't touch it. They couldn't say anything about it. So it was the right impulse. It took a year to get around to symmetry, but even during the year when everyone was afraid there was going to be a war, there were secret contacts between the United States and North Korea, State Department diplomats, CIA spies, and their North Korean counterparts, secret contacts about holding a summit. And so finally, of course, there was a summit, the first summit in Singapore in 2018.
And this again was another very hopeful period, something that I thought was interesting in your book. We talked about some of the American envoys in Pyongyang, like touring sites for an embassy. They were looking at the former East German embassy, and there was like a sense that things could happen.
Well, yeah, that was in the run-up to the Hanoi summit, which was in the early 2019, the second summit.
I mean, the first summit was considered generally a success, no? I mean,
well, a lot of people thought they were going to go into this first summit, government officials, pundits. A lot of people thought, well, gee, Trump has to come out of this summit with a detailed denuclearization deal. And he didn't. He came out with a pretty anodyne summit statement, but it started the United States and North Korea on this glide path to the more serious summit, which was Hanoi, months later. So, it was successful in that sense. But I mean, the more serious encounter was in Hanoi.
And why there were various explanations about why that failed. I mean, I think there were various parties trying to sabotage things, including John Bolton. There was Trump's own impatience that when the deal was not forthcoming,
Yeah.
he kind of walked. I mean, what was your interpretation of this?
Well, that's an important question. But before I get into that, there's another important issue here, which is, the Hanoi summit ended in failure. I think everyone knows that. In fact, before the summit actually took place, the American and North Korean negotiators reached a long document, agreed on a long document that essentially resolved all of the issues the United States and North Korea had been discussing for decades. So establishing diplomatic relations, people-to-people exchanges, sending the Pyongyang State Orchestra to the United States, negotiating a peace treaty. It was all there. And there were two issues that weren't there, the nuclear issue and the lifting of sanctions in return issue. Those were left for the two leaders. So it was very close to a major agreement. Obviously, the two major issues weren't resolved. But I think what is important there is Trump was not looking for a big deal. He wasn't looking for a complete denuclearization immediately. He was looking for a small deal, a first step down the road to denuclearization. And that first step was that dismantling that Yanbian facility. But he and Kim couldn't agree to that. They couldn't agree. Kim wanted to lift all sanctions in return for dismantling Yanbian. Trump didn't want to lift all the sanctions, so they haggled. And Trump, who is not a patient guy, decided to walk out. And he'd done this many times in many meetings, in many negotiations before, including his two divorce proceedings. He walked out. The problem was, as he was about to walk out, US and North Korean negotiators were meeting in a hallway, making progress on a deal. And as they were making progress, Trump walked by them and he walked out the door and got in his car. And the American delegation had no choice. They had to follow the president. So they walked out too, and it cut short that negotiation. And, the summit collapsed. Even Trump may have had some doubts, because when he got on the airplane, Air Force One, to leave Hanoi, the first person he called was President Moon of South Korea. And he said to President Moon, not once, but seven times, can you get in touch with Kim Jong Un and see how he's feeling? Well, I learned from talking to someone else, Kim Jong Un was obviously not happy, because when Trump walked out, Kim Jong Un went back to his hotel, went into his room, and slammed the door. So he was embarrassed by what happened. So the summit ended badly. Why did it end badly? And, I think there's still this myth that John Bolton somehow engineered, John Bolton, the neocon, who never supported negotiations with North Korea, going back to the Bush administration. There was this myth that somehow he engineered the collapse. Somehow, he had this magic hold over Trump, and as a result, he engineered the collapse. Not true at all. Because early on, John Bolton had been cut out of policymaking in the Trump administration. He was kept in the dark by the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, and his negotiator, Steve Biegun. So, Bolton didn't realize what was going on, and he came back into the picture just before Hanoi, and he tried to sell the president the big deal, what's called the Libya model, which is, give up all your nuclear facilities, nuclear weapons, everything, and then we'll give you some sanctions relief. He tried to sell Trump the model. Trump said he's not interested. And so you can read in Bolton's book that he made a number of suggestions to Trump during the summit, and Trump just sort of blew him off, didn't care what he was suggesting.
Jill, I have the really tough question for you now. And do you believe that North Korea would have ever denuclearized? Because I've heard this conventional wisdom from people who maybe don't know that much, but that they will not denuclearize, that the leadership saw what happened in Libya when Gaddafi was killed, Saddam Hussein was killed, and that their feeling in Iraq, their feeling was that the only thing that protected them from being, a vulnerable shithole country, as Trump might call it, was their nuclear weapons. And that this was just, all kind of a game and kind of a waste of time. And, you use this expression, nuclear peekaboo. They were always playing nuclear peekaboo, letting inspectors look at this and that. But would they have ever really gone all the way? And there's a lot of what ifs here. Like, what if Gore had won the election to succeed Clinton, if those Chads went a different way? If you remember the disputed 2000 election, would if Trump hadn't walked out, like, could this have ever worked? And you seem to believe that it could, but I mean, I think others don't.
Well, I have a friend who I saw a few weeks ago, and he said to me, and he was a government official, and he said to me, the North Koreans, they were never serious. And I said to him, well, how did you reach that conclusion? And he didn't have any data to suggest that. He just said they were never serious. So it was a feeling.
Mm-hmm.
I think all the evidence suggests they were serious. And starting in the early 1990s with this geopolitical shift, and we had information that this was a decision made by the leadership. And I think they were serious all along. And certainly during the Clinton administration, they were serious. The agreed framework was a serious agreement. And what most people don't understand was at the time we reached the agreement, we had intelligence estimates telling us that by the end of the decade, the North Koreans could have 100 nuclear weapons based on the facilities they were building. Well, in implementing the agreed framework, those facilities were not built. They were trashed. And so at the end of the decade, they may have had enough material for 5 nuclear weapons. So you could argue, well, all this was a charade. They were just pretending. But I don't see it that way. So you can keep rolling forward. Were they serious under Bush? I think they were serious. They were willing to negotiate a stronger deal once they had been discovered cheating. They were willing to negotiate a stronger deal, but the Bush administration didn't want to do that. Under Obama, I didn't get into it, but there were multiple opportunities to have a negotiation on nuclear denuclearization. I'm not saying they would have reached deals as a result, but we didn't even try to do that. Obama didn't try to do that. I have a list of opportunities: 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016. But because of this policy of strategic patience, we didn't really engage them. Under Trump, and let's take Hanoi as an example. The North Koreans, I think Kim Jong Un was seriously interested in taking that first step down the road to denuclearization and dismantling Yanbian. Moreover, before then, in one of his letters, there were 27 letters between Trump and Kim Jong Un. In one of his letters, he basically said to Trump, let's do this first step, and I'm going to put on the chopping block my nuclear weapons lab, which nuclear experts thought, well, this could be the heart of their nuclear program. During a meeting with Mike Pompeo and Steve Biegun in the fall of 2018, Kim Jong Un returned to that theme once again. He said, yes, we can get rid of Yanbian and more. He returned to that again. There's more to this story, though. In Hanoi, I think he was serious about a first phase denuclearization deal. And on top of that, one of the reasons why the North Koreans are interested in this is domestic, and it has to do with modernizing their economy. So if you look at the January 2019 New Year's statement by Kim Jong Un, he is talking about shifting resources from the military economy to the civilian economy. He's talking about cutting back defense spending. And he's also talking about taking defense industries and using them to contribute to the civilian economy. So all of these things point to someone who's serious about moving down the road to denuclearization.
Do you think that the US has to accept North Korea as a nuclear power in order to move forward?
Yeah, this gets tricky now. I don't think, denuclearization is now it's just not on the table, obviously, for so many reasons. And Kim Jong Un has said that. And what I would say is that what we need to do is dance around that issue a little bit. We shouldn't accept them as a nuclear power. And what we should do is, and I don't see Trump doing this because he's not sophisticated enough, but what we should do is acknowledge that they have nuclear weapons and we don't like it. And we're going to work to deal with that and leave it at that. Don't call them a nuclear power. Just be very careful about what you say. And the priority today should be reducing the risk of nuclear war.
What about human rights? I think it has been suggested that if we're not making progress on nuclear disarmament, what about human rights? Maybe it's time to move that one up.
I don't understand the logic of why would the North Koreans engage a hostile country on human rights? Why would they engage the United States? Why would they engage any of the other countries with whom they don't have a very good relationship on an issue like human rights? We've gone through this many times, over the past 30 years. where, of course, there's been a lot of pressure to deal with North Korean human rights violations. But the point here is that in order to deal with human rights violations, you need a better relationship with the North Koreans. You need a better political relationship with them. And in those circumstances, they do engage on human rights and have in the past. But when you don't have those circumstances, they're not going to talk about it.
Just getting up to the present, I'm sort of skipping over the Biden administration because I don't think much
There's
happened.
not much to talk
Well,
about.
let's get to the second Trump administration. I mean, is he going to go back to it? He's talked about reaching out to Kim Jong Un, and I can imagine, him saying, and you can't really blame him. Well, you've got the Middle East, you've got North Korea, you've got Russia, Ukraine. Where are you gonna make progress?
I'm not sure he's that logical, but yeah, this is a tough one for me because I thought Trump did the right thing when he engaged in symmetry before. But I'm not so sure it'd be a wise thing to get him in a room now with Kim Jong Un. And there are a number of reasons for that. First of all, North Korea is in a very different place today than it was in 2019. It's not interested in a better relationship with the United States, and certainly not interested in a better relationship with South Korea. Everyone talks about this new axis with Russia and China. And of course, Russia and China, the relationship with the United States is not very good. So that sort of colors what Kim's approach would be to a summit. Secondly, he's engaged in a lot of activities which are pretty threatening. He's modernizing his conventional military. He's modernizing his defense industries. He's talking about war preparations. As I said earlier, his attitude to South Korea is very hostile. So all these things, I think, combine to create a very different Kim Jong Un than the Kim Jong Un of 2019. On top of that, President Trump, for lack of a better word, is unconstrained now. He's able to do his own thing without any advisors who are going to try to rein him in. So in the 2019 timeframe, he had advisors who were trying to steer him. He had Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, Steve Biegun, who was the North Korean negotiator. And they were formulating policies that Trump signed off on. Nowadays, I don't think those people don't exist. And moreover, even if they did exist, Trump probably wouldn't listen because he said publicly, no one knows Kim Jong Un better than me. So he might go off on his own tangent. And the problem is that tangent it's certainly going to be stopping U.S. South Korean joint military exercises. But the tangent might also be starting to withdraw U.S. troops from South Korea, which is something Kim Jong Un wouldn't mind because he's all about increasing his own influence in the region and decreasing Washington's influence. So I'm left to, I don't know what to say, except it might not be a good idea for the two of them to get in a room together.
I think we're up to questions. I don't know if there's anybody online or anybody in the room. Yep.
Yeah, I was. Okay. I wanted to hear a bit more about like the book making process, I guess. Kind of like trying to like finding this like central thread throughout the work, and like also kind of coming to the decision of being like, oh, I'm gonna publish a book about this. And I was especially like interested in the like first sentence, or like the first like few sentences that you read out about the hostage situation. Like, there's so many instances that you could have started the book from, but like it kind of feels like you're just thrown right into like an action scene. But I'm sure there's like more, like there's more to it. So I'd love to hear kind of the thoughts behind the structuring of your book, especially like the beginnings and ends of
That was
the
a good
section.
first sentence, wasn't it?
It was really good.
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
knew it was a good one.
Yeah.
And it sort of came to me.
Yeah.
That's a really good question. Hey, I've been working on this issue for a long time. And I hate to say it, but it's 30 years. And I've done it from different perches. So when I was at the State Department, spent a lot of time working with North Koreans, talking to them, visiting their country, negotiating with them. When I was in the think tank world, I met with them overseas regularly. And also, when you're in the think tank world, you're surrounded by a lot of other people. And I probably shouldn't say this, but a lot of people have no experience dealing with North Korea, but think they know all about it. And that's why we established our website, 38 North, because we were thinking there are people out there who have real experience and they need to be heard. So, and over these 30 years, I've sort of gone through this, lived in this milieu, this environment where repeatedly people would say things about North Korea and its policies and the United States and about its policies, which I knew were wrong. They weren't based on real analysis. They were based on, whatever, someone sitting at a desk reading a book or without any real world experience. So, I'm trying to remember, when did I decide? I decided to write a book because I was getting bored with listening to all these people who didn't know what they were talking about. And I started this like 7 years ago. I started the research 7 years ago. And my objective was not to write an academic book, but to write a book that would essentially bring the readers into the room where things are happening, whether it's a negotiation or, armed clashes on the Korean Peninsula or meetings of spies in Singapore. And to do that, of course, I had to do a lot of interviews. As I mentioned, or Barbara mentioned, I did 300 interviews of Americans, South Koreans, all officials who had participated in events, Chinese, and, my own experiences meeting with North Koreans. And I had to shape that into a narrative. And, that was my objective. And whether I accomplish it or not is up to the reader, of course. But that was my objective, and that's why it took so long. A choice about how to begin a book. I mean, Barbara has written 5 books, so she probably knows more about it than I do. But, I thought, well, gee, your first sentence has to really grab the reader, or whatever the first thing you're talking about has to really pique their interest. And I think that particular incident did. So I don't know, does that answer your question, or are you thinking of writing a book?
I think that would be nice. Yeah. I'm honestly working on like my thesis right now, and I'm having similar questions of like, how do I make like the beginning of a chapter interesting, or how do I grab a reader's attention? So like when I heard that, I was like, oh, I wish I could have something like that.
Well, that's probably, that was the one experience where I thought this is going to really grab people. If I talk about sitting in a room in Geneva negotiating, probably not going to grab them at the beginning of the book. But, if I had one piece of advice, and I'm sure Barbara has advice, for someone writing a book, or I don't know about a thesis, but you really got to be obsessed with the subject.
We were talking about this a lot before you came in, about the process of writing a book, saying it's sort of like a relationship, because you commit to it for, I mean, it's taken me 5 years basically to do all my books. And, there's just so many times I'm thinking, this sucks. The book is no good. I'm not enjoying it. Why did I start this? And I think, oh, this is pretty good. I actually think I love this book. And it's just like, it's back and forth.
Oh my God. Yeah. And I don't know if you've gone through this, but I've lost count about how many times I've read through this manuscript. I mean, I don't know, reading it, editing it, 375 pages it ended up. Editing it, paragraph, sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph, over and over again. And you're probably a better writer than I am. But
then you go over it a million times, then you have some like bratty reader who says, I see a typo on page 380.
And and I'm not going to say where, but I actually discovered a mistake in the hard copy. And it's like, oh my God, no. Yeah. But, 375 pages, there are going to be more mistakes. So I used to joke with friends, because I went through it so many times. I'm not a classical scholar by any means, but, Homer, when he recited the Iliad, would do it. It was a verbal thing. He wasn't writing it down. So I would joke with friends that I could probably be like Homer and recite this book if someone asked me to do that. That's how much I went through it.
Check if there's anyone.
So,
oh, here's a question.
Right.
Yeah, thank you for your dedication to the peace of Korean Peninsula and your valuable experience. I'm from South Korea, so but South Koreans was worried about this situation, but as you said before, and nuclearization. I have two questions. First, considering the recent situation in Iran, so do you think the United States will carry out a preemptive or prevent attack against North Korea? And second question is, I would appreciate it if you could share any specific measures for North Korea's denuclearization. Thank you.
I didn't get into detail, but as I mentioned, I think before, President Obama ordered the Pentagon to come up with a plan for a preemptive attack to destroy North Korea's arsenal. And they couldn't do it because North Korea has mobile missiles. They've had more and more over the years. And they couldn't guarantee they would find every one of them. So, and also, of course, that the North Koreans might retaliate by starting a war with South Korea. That's very different from Iran. There's no comparison. So, the chance, even though I bet you our ability to destroy North Korean missiles has improved since President Obama ordered the Pentagon to do that, I still don't think we're able to wipe out their program. And, you know, are you willing to risk the possibility that you launch a preemptive attack, you destroy a lot of missiles, but then there are missiles coming at American cities? They've been launched.
Maybe Trump doesn't care about missiles launched at South Korean cities, though.
No, he might not care about that. That's absolutely true. And that's the thing that's different nowadays than in the past. North Korea now has its own nuclear umbrella, right? I mean, this is the whole issue of extended deterrence. And so one of the scenarios experts talk about today is that if North Korea was going to start a war with South Korea, it could do that with impunity because an American nuclear threat, Americans might not make a nuclear threat against North Korea, knowing that they would be putting their cities at risk. So this is it's a much more different, much more complicated situation than with Iran, where, you know, what's Iran going to do? What are they going to do to retaliate? They didn't do hardly anything. I mean, they try to attack Israel. Israel, you know, shoots down their missiles. Very different. On your second question, suggestions for denuclearization, you know, you could start with, and this is a big if, you got to start very small. So you could say, okay, you know, we know you're not going to give up your weapons. How about not testing your long-range missiles? Or how about not conducting nuclear tests? But I suspect the North Koreans are going to want something in return, and it may not be sanctions lifting. It may be, okay, you know, then the United States shouldn't be sending bombers that may be carrying nuclear weapons to fly over the peninsula. And you shouldn't let your submarines that are carrying nuclear weapons stop at the peninsula, which they're doing. So, you know, it may be that kind of trade. Right now, sanctions are, you know, they're meaningless almost.
You mean talk is more important than maximum pressure?
There is no, what's maximum pressure on North Korea? What kind of strategy would you put together?
I mean, this maximum pressure means that, like SSN or SSBN or the United States going to South Korea, and then there are lots of munition or very good missiles or deployed to South Korea.
Yeah, if that's what you mean by maximum pressure, I think that's more of a trade than sanctions lifting, since, you know, Russia and China aren't enforcing sanctions anymore.
Yeah.
This young lady here.
No.
I just I know in the last question you talked about like wanting to write this book because of the lack of kind of connection of people in think tanks and stuff to the experiences and the like lived reality of negotiations in North Korea. I'm just curious. I know you mentioned like part of the issue that arises from that is this idea that like North Korea was never serious about negotiations. I was just wondering if there's how would you characterize the I apologize. The other like how would you characterize this the understanding in think tanks like of North Korea that like is divorced from reality? Like in what other ways does that kind of
Look, I don't, you know, I'm probably being unnecessarily harsh, So let me try to put that in a little bit more context, which is I'm not saying the North Koreans are angels and people don't recognize that. I mean, the part of the problem here is not just the United States. I mean, the North Koreans decided to change their foreign policy, right, in the early 1990s. But it wasn't as if they just snapped their fingers and all of a sudden they become angels. You know, they had trouble engineering that change. And part of that was because North Korea is a small country, you know, and they were dealing with the United States. And if there's one thing North Koreans want to be, it's tough. So they had to demonstrate they're tough. And so you'd get provocations, what we call provocation, missile tests, nuclear tests. They had to show us that they were a difficult country to deal with. And that fed into their negotiating strategy. But beyond that, there's no guarantee. They had no guarantee everything was going to work out, you know, that diplomacy would work out. And obviously it didn't. So they needed to have a safety net for themselves. And the safety net was continuing to develop their weapons programs. And it turned out to be a smart move because diplomacy didn't work out and they have their safety net. So I'm sorry, what was the rest of the question though?
I think it was more of just like
Oh, I know.
how you feel the difference was between think tanks.
Yeah. Look, you know, Barbara's been a foreign correspondent. She's lived in China. She's had real hands-on experience with China and Chinese people, Chinese government officials. And the key word is their hands-on experience. So I could distinguish between people in Washington who've had no hands-on experience with North Korea, or even with being in government. You can tell the difference between people who've been in government, people who haven't. You can distinguish between that and people who've had real hands-on experience. And that experience, I think, has an enormous effect on their ability to analyze what another country is doing and what's going on there. And if I could just say one last thing, this has been a serious problem with the US intelligence community in dealing with North Korea. For the most part, they've had no hands-on experience. And it's colored their estimates of what motivates North Korea and what it's doing.
Thank you.
This is usually what happens, right? You ask for questions, no one raises a hand, then someone breaks the ice, and then everyone's going to ask a question.
That's
So
good.
you're next.
It's good.
Oh, hello. Thank you for your talk. I could not personally agree more when you said sanctions are not working at this stage, especially because I'm currently working at the U.S. Security Council as a researcher alongside my work in alongside my studies at Columbia. I technically do not cover the North Korea related issues. I'm more of a thematic like WPS person. But still, it made me wonder. So more about your methodologies and the interviews. I think it's such an impressive number, 300 people around across the US, North and South Korea and China. And I was just wondering how, if you could share your general impression on how different it was to talk to or communicate with or interview basically diplomats and policymakers from different state governments, and also if there's a specific figure or figures that were particularly impressive to you in your research process.
You know, I've been asked this before and I've thought about it. Well, how was it different talking to people from different countries? And, you know, one of the things about the book if you buy it, which I hope you will, is that I didn't use names of people in the interviews. I sort of had descriptions, like US government official, White House official. I didn't use names, and that's the same thing for the officials and experts from other countries. So what I found was, that sort of opened it up to them being quite open with me and quite honest. And so I didn't really notice big differences. I didn't interview North Koreans. I didn't say to them, gee, I'm writing a book. What do you think about this? But what the book has is the record of all the Track 2 meetings that we had, me and some other colleagues, with North Korean government officials, including Chae Sun-hee, who's now the foreign minister. And these were private meetings, and they were very open meetings. So that's the North Korean portion. So the bottom line is I didn't notice big differences between people because of what countries they were in. I noticed big differences in terms of what their overall views were, and also, the memory issue. If you're going to do a lot of interviews, the memory issue is one you really got to think about. So a lot of what I did was I confirmed. I had, say, 2 different interviewers talking about the same thing, and it, often jived. They often said the same things, had the same memories. I'm sorry, was there a second part to your question, or?
Oh, yes, just a quick question. If there was any interesting figure or figures that you
Oh,
encountered.
yeah. Well, a couple of the reviews had said they're clearly, heroes and villains. And, I started this book in 2017 when Steve Bosworth was still alive. And I don't know if everyone knows who Steve Bosworth was, but he was one of the premier U.S. diplomats of the post-Cold War era. And I won't go through his whole career, but I started to encounter him when we picked him to run the organization that was building the reactors. And then he became the U.S. ambassador to South Korea. And later on, he was President Obama's special envoy. And he was an extraordinary person who believed in engagement. And so he's one of the heroes in the book. He appears in part of the book. I think Steve Biegun is another important person. He was Trump's special envoy. And he did a magnificent job in steering the Trump administration into the Hanoi summit. And it was not his fault that it failed. So those are 2 of the heroes. The villains, maybe I shouldn't talk too much about some of them, but certainly people in the Bush administration, there were a lot of villains there, including, I have to say, the one villain I am going to highlight is John Bolton, who, to me is everything that's wrong with American foreign policy. And he's been that way for decades. And so certainly a villain during the Bush administration, the George Bush administration, and certainly a villain during the Trump administration. Now, I know that's not the common view of John Bolton because he was, always trashing Donald Trump, and leaving aside everything else, on the North Korea issue, he was a villain.
Thank you.
I'm glad you asked me that question because it was one of the things I wanted to do in the book, was depict John Bolton in a way that was accurate. And I hope he's not watching. Anyway, sorry. Any other questions, or I guess we're at the end of our time?
There's one comment. It's from, sorry if I'm mispronouncing, but Srinath Paul Carson. They said, I don't have a question, but I just wanted to thank you for such an interesting talk. I have read both of your work leading up to my trip to North Korea in 2011 with the Pyongyang project as an undergraduate student. I don't work in this area, but it remains a topic of interest.
Very kind.
But if no one else has any,
Thing from John Bolton.
no, luckily not. But yes, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you Joel and Barbara again
Thank you.
for joining us.
I was gonna